Jason Fung, nephrologist and best-selling author, shares his experiences utilizing an individualized approach to fasting to successfully treat thousands of overweight, metabolically ill, and diabetic patients, and why being a doctor who specializes in kidney disease gives him a unique insight into early indications of metabolic disease. Let's listen to Dr. Jason Fung.
This whole calories in, calories out thing. It's complete nonsense. The body has no calorie receptors. What is important is sort of what causes you to eat more, which is calories in, or burn more, which is calories out. And we eat more because we're hungry, for example, and you can't decide to be less hungry. You can't decide for your body to burn more calories. So focusing in on the calories is very short-sighted because it's really just the mechanism and not the cause of the obesity. And you can think about it in terms of money. So, for example, if you say poverty, what causes poverty? Well, if you spend more money than you take in, then you're going to be poor. And it's like, it's as if I was saying, that's the solution to everything, people. Money in versus money out. And anybody who doesn't believe me is a money denier. It's like, well, that's stupid, right? That's just the mechanism of how you get poverty. Similarly with calories, that's how you become overweight, is because too many calories are going out, but it tells you nothing about why that is the case. So then it comes back down to what is causing it. And the body is really run by hormones. And the main hormone from a dietary standpoint is insulin. Insulin is a hormone that goes up when we eat and basically tells your body to store body fat. That's its job. The only thing that doesn't raise insulin is actually pure fat. So if you drink olive oil, for example. Right. But if you eat something like an egg, which has protein, then insulin will still go up. Your blood sugar will not go up, but your insulin will. So insulin is essentially a nutrient sensor, except for pure fat. But natural food is not, like, nobody normally goes around eating a stick of butter sort of thing. Some foods spike insulin a lot more than others. So if you were to eat, say, steak versus, say, bread, the bread is going to spike your insulin much higher than the steak. Mm-hmm. The steak will to some degree. And the implication is simply that some foods are more fattening than others. And it's like, okay, that's not that, revolutionary statement.
Can I ask you, what does it mean when you say something has a low glycemic index? Does that mean it
glycemic index talks about blood glucose. So if you eat a food, then your blood glucose goes up or it doesn't. And it really only refers to carbohydrates because blood glucose does not go up with protein or fats. So it really only applies to the carbohydrate portion of your meal. So if you
how is that related to insulin?
There's a relationship between how high your glucose goes up and how high your insulin goes up, but it doesn't tell you anything about the sort of protein and fat. So 2/3 of your macronutrients are not being accounted for by a glycemic index, which only accounts for the carbohydrate part of things. And for the carbohydrate part of things, it does reasonably. But if you're going to ignore sort of 2/3 of the problem, it's not a very comprehensive sort of dietary plan. Right, and that's where things get a little hairy. People focus on the blood glucose, but it wasn't the blood glucose. Your body responds to things like insulin, hormones like insulin. Now, there are other hormones involved too, but from a diet standpoint, it's mostly insulin. So insulin is a nutrient sensor, and it goes up when we eat and tells the body to store food energy. That's what body fat is. It's stored food energy. So if you let your insulin levels fall, that's a signal for your body to start burning the stored food energy, which is fat. That's all it is. So if you keep insulin high all the time, you're basically telling your body to store fat all the time. And that's all it is. They fluctuate quite a bit. So measuring levels are not that useful. I mean, I've measured them for different reasons, but they fluctuate quite a bit. So it's not as useful as you might think it is. It's more useful as a sort of theoretical understanding of why something like fasting is useful. So fasting, for example, is a way to lower insulin levels. If you don't eat, insulin falls, which is what it's supposed to do. but other hormones go up, and this is what everybody forgets about. So when you fast, you actually activate certain other hormonal systems. So sympathetic nervous system, noradrenaline, and growth hormone, and cortisol. So cortisol does go up with fasting. So the sympathetic nervous system is part of the fight or flight response,
Right.
and it's a general activation of the body, as is cortisol. And what these sympathetic nervous system and cortisol and other hormones like noradrenaline do is that they push glucose from stores into the blood. So they all raise blood glucose. And that's the point. So if you're not eating, so remember that when you don't eat, insulin falls and these counter-regulatory hormones. So the counter-regulatory hormones are so named because they run counter of insulin. So insulin goes down, these ones go up, and they all go up as a group. So sympathetic nervous system, and essentially what it does is it activates your body. So everybody thinks that fasting slows down your body. It doesn't. It activates the body. And that's a natural mechanism that we've known about for years, because you're activating the sympathetic nervous system, you're increasing noradrenaline, and you're increasing growth hormone. Now, growth hormone is very interesting because it's like, why would you want to grow if there's no nutrients? And the point is that when you start eating again, then growth hormone is there so that you can rebuild the proteins that you need for sort of optimum health. So even though people worry about, oh, you're going to break down muscle, it's like, no, but you're going to regrow that muscle or protein or whatever you need at that point that you could start eating again. So it's a natural seesaw. So insulin goes up, these hormones go down, insulin goes down, these hormones go up. And it's this changing. What you're doing with the fasting is changing the entire hormonal sort of environment of the body. It's not about restricting calories, because restricting calories, you can restrict calories and keep your insulin very high, for example. If you take a lot of stevia or something like that, or diet drinks, there's no calories, but insulin still goes up with some of these artificial sweeteners. So if you drink sort of 20 Diet Cokes a day and you think, oh, I'm doing so good, it's like you're not. Your insulin's still going up, which is telling your body to store fat. And if you don't eat, that is, you've restricted your calories from, say, 2,000 calories to 1,000 calories, for example, but you're drinking all Diet Cokes. Your insulin's high, your body gets the message that it needs to store fat, but you're only getting 1,000 calories. So you can't burn fat at the same time you're storing fat. So this is part of the way the body works. It's like the seesaw, right? So one goes up, one goes down. It's the same thing. You can either store body fat or you can burn body fat, but you can't do both. If your insulin is high, you're storing body fat, so you're not burning it. If your insulin is high because you're eating all these sort of diet foods and all this stuff, and you're only taking 1,000 calories, your body says, well, I still need to store that body fat. Therefore, what I need to do is shut down my metabolism. And therefore, that's when you start to see the metabolic rate go down. People feel cold, people feel tired, and it's because they never change the hormonal balance in their body. That's the key to weight loss. It's not calories. Calories is just like talking about money. It's like, oh, if you get sick with cancer and therefore you have a lot of medical bills, you can go bankrupt, right? But it's, so that's the cause of your disease. It's not money in, money out, right? Oh, stop spending money. It's like, that's a useless advice. Just the same way that saying, oh, it's all about calories in. It's useless advice. You have to know how it is that the body changes the calories in and the calories out. So, for example, if you think about a big Coca-Cola, big gulp, you take a big gulp of Coca-Cola. It has a lot of calories. It has a lot of sugar. And compare that to an equal calorie portion of a steak. Now, you can say, okay, well, it's all about calories. Well, if you drink that Coke, you're not full. If you eat that steak, you are full. So what's going to happen? Well, if you rigidly count all your calories all the time, you might do okay, but you're going to be hungry day after day after day because you're drinking Coke instead of eating steak. But it's the same calories. But the difference is that, your insulin's spiking way up, so you're still hungry after that Coca-Cola. And whereas with the steak, you've got all that protein and all that fat that's making you full, so you're not going to be full. So it's a lot easier to lose weight eating steak or salad or any other sort of real food compared to sugary beverages, for example.
Right.
But the calories are not the issue. The issue is that you're going to want to eat more if you're just taking a bunch of Coke, because you're going to be like, that's not dinner. A big gulp is not dinner. Yeah, so I think that the main problem, like sort of, there's a lot of issues, but the number one problem with weight gain is that people eat all the time.
Mm-hmm.
This is not because they thought it was a great idea. It's because this is a sort of message that's pushed on us by dietitians, by doctors. And unfortunately, a lot of the industry, like food industry and drug industry, pays a lot of these doctors and other health professionals, and they tell them, oh yeah, you should tell your patients to eat 10 times a day. It's like, who came up with that? It's stupid. Like, it sounds really stupid. Eat all the time to lose weight. It's like, it sounds really stupid because it is really stupid. Like, there's no getting around that. And there's no studies that said that eating 10 times a day is good for you. In fact, nobody in the history of humanity has ever done that because it's stupid. So if you look at the 1970s, for example, the difference between the 1970s and the 2000s is that in the 1970s, the average person ate 3 times a day: breakfast, lunch, dinner. Ate at 7 in the morning, ate at dinner at 7 at night. It's 12 hours of eating and 12 hours of fasting. In other words, 12 hours that you're storing fat and 12 hours you're burning fat. So they're eating, remember, in the 70s, and I grew up in the 70s, they're eating white bread. There's no whole wheat bread. As a kid during the 70s, never touched the whole wheat bread, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whole wheat pasta did not exist. White pasta all the time. And I'm Chinese, so white rice all the time. And guess what? In the 70s, there's virtually no obesity.
Right.
It's still white bread and jam. It's still ice cream. But the key is that they didn't eat all the time. If you look at studies of eating patterns, so the most recent study looked at sort of the average time that people eat it, and it was like 14 hours and 45 minutes per day. So if you ate breakfast at 8 a.m., you didn't stop eating until 10:45 p.m. And the average number of times people ate was getting up towards 6. So we went from 3 to 6. And you see this all the time. People think it's okay or even healthy to eat constantly. So it's like, you eat breakfast, and then you have a meeting at 10 o'clock while somebody brings muffins. And then you have lunch, and then you have an afternoon meeting, and somebody thinks you need to have cookies. And it's like, okay, but nobody ever needed that. And the point is that if you're eating all the time, you're not allowing your body to sort of digest that food. In fact, you're not doing that because you're not stopping eating until 10:45 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
That means the only time you're basically not eating is when you're sleeping. And then you wonder, okay, well, why are we all getting obese? It's because we're telling our bodies to gain weight for that whole time. We're not giving it the time it needs to digest that food, to burn off the food energy that you've taken. And when you do that, then the natural sort of satiety mechanisms go in. So, I mean, if I had to choose one thing, I would say making sure that every day you balance sort of feeding and fasting. Now, there are things, of course, you should eat real foods. You should try and cook at home. You should avoid the ultra processed foods, the bar-coded foods. That's all very important too. So the question of what to eat, which is your diet, and should you eat sort of Big Macs or should you eat, pasta, that kind of thing. Those are good questions, but that's a question that we sort of obsess about. Like, everybody talks about, oh, should we eat whole grain? Should we eat quinoa? It's like, it's not like in the 70s we were dying because we didn't eat quinoa, right? We're doing all right. There's no obesity there, right? It's not a quinoa deficiency disease. So these I actually like quinoa, but but the point is that it's not, don't go looking for these sort of foods that we never ate before as the solution to our problem. Right. Look at what changed from the 70s to now. I mean, they're eating meat and potatoes like in the 70s. So go back to that. But they're also not eating all the time. And that's the key. And even the English language itself tells us that there's a breakfast, which is the meal that breaks your fast. So that tells you that fasting is a part of everyday life. There's feeding and there's fasting. Then you break your fast. Whereas now we never fast because we're eating until sort of like 10:45 and then eating the minute we get up, sort of thing. Somebody is going to tell you, oh, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. As soon as you wake up before your feet even hit the floor. You should start stuffing muffins into your mouth because that's healthy for you. Like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, you need to break your fast, but you can break your fast at 12. You can break your fast at 2. It doesn't really matter. If you're not hungry at breakfast, why are you shoving food in your mouth? That's going to make you lose weight. On the other hand, if you like to eat breakfast, you like to eat eggs and sort of, then go ahead. But keep in mind that you can't eat all the time. You have to take a break. You have to fast. That's what the very word itself tells you what you're supposed to be doing. And if you do that sort of on a regular basis, remember that people didn't watch what they ate in the 70s, really, because there wasn't that much obesity. It's actually striking if you ever look at like school photos from the 70s and stuff. You know, that one guy who was overweight got made fun of mercilessly because he was only one guy. Now you take a look and it's like, oh yeah, but a third of the class looks like him, right? So who's going to make fun of him? Which is great. They're not picking on him anymore. But on the other hand, not so great because there's a lot of childhood obesity that's the same thing. People think we need to eat all the time. So that's where intermittent fasting comes in, because if you want to lose weight, then all you have to do is shift the balance the other way and do more fasting than feeding. And then you're going to force your body to burn food energy. So if you ate 2 meals a day, sort of breakfast and dinner, you ate at 7 a.m., by 11 a.m. or so, 12 noons, for example, your body is going to go into sort of fasting mode because it's that energy has lasted you a few hours, assuming you're not going crazy on your breakfast, right? But that energy has started, you've burnt it off, insulin levels are going to fall, then you're going to use it. Now you skip lunch and you don't eat until 7. So you've got 7 hours of fasting in the middle of the day there. Like, as long as you understand what you're doing and you're getting the results that you want, then there's nothing wrong. I tend to work with sort of the very severe end of the scale. So people who are sort of type 2 diabetes and massively overweight and so on, that to the point that it's a health issue. Therefore, I wind up prescribing much longer fasting periods just because these people are at high risk of other problems heart attacks and strokes and stuff. Right. Yeah. So there's no strict definition of intermittent fasting. So what happened in the 60s, the reason fasting sort of fell out of favor from a medical standpoint is that they used to do these crazy, crazy fasts where they take people who are not even overweight and they'd fast them for like 60 days straight. So nothing to eat for 60 days. That's pretty tough if you're pretty thin already. So if you're massively overweight, sure, you could do it because you have the stores of fat to go 60 days without eating. But they take a guy who is sort of like, 5'10" and 150 pounds and tell him to go 60 days without eating. Not a very good idea. So anyway, so they did this, and that's what they called fasting back then. And then they'd test them, and some people were not doing that well because they were actually becoming malnourished. And that's the problem. So this intermittent fasting is more, you're talking about doing fasting for short periods of time. So anywhere from sort of 12 to 24, 36 hours. So clearly not in the same league as the old studies from the 60s of 30 to 60 days. We're talking like 30 hours, not 30 days. So it's much shorter, but doing it on a more regular basis. So and remember, studies from the 60s and stuff, they're doing it for different reasons. At the time, they're talking about world hunger and starvation and Malthusian principles of world hunger. So they wanted to see what happened when people actually starved, not fasting from a therapeutic standpoint. So it's a totally different situation. But what we're talking about now is applying sort of short-term fast, sort of 16 hours, 24 hours, on a regular basis, 3 times a week, 6 times a week, that kind of thing, in order to achieve a specific goal, which is reversal of type 2 diabetes or weight loss, for example. Those are the biggest goals, but there are others. I mean, there are lots of health benefits. And what we're finding now, which is super, super interesting, is that there's all kinds of benefits to fasting that people hadn't realized before. So it's it's just a very interesting field that's sort of changing all the time. Yeah, so there's a few. In terms of training, so one of the big things in terms of elite athletics these days is something called training in the fasted state, and it's something that is, if you understand the physiology, you can see the reasoning. So what people do is that they don't eat for 24 hours. So they say, for example, they might eat breakfast and then not eat until for 24 hours. Then they do their training. So they've already fasted for 24 hours. Then they go on their workout and then they eat. So why would you do this? So if you think about what's happening, insulin is going down. So as you fast, insulin goes down, but noradrenaline, sympathetic nervous system go up, growth hormone goes up. So at that point, you're actually flooding your body with energy. So you actually can work out harder. And a lot of people have noticed this. It's a noticeable effect. People do their fasting and then they exercise, and then they get comments like, whoa, I could go, so much without even trying today. And then as soon as you start to eat, what happens is that growth hormone is very high. So then you're going to rebuild that muscle, because remember, when you're building muscle, you get these microscopic tears in your muscle. Your body rebuilds it to be stronger. But if your growth hormone goes up, then you're going to be able to rebuild better. So in fact, what's happening is that you're able to train harder and recover faster. So that's a huge, huge advantage when you're talking about, elite athletics, because the difference between sort of being a Hall of Famer in baseball and a minor leaguer is like inches. So that little bit of extra, training, that little bit of extra can really make a huge difference. And then the other thing, and this is especially true for certain things. So we work with some elite athletes like baseball players and, mixed martial arts and stuff, is that concentration goes up significantly when you're fasting. So because of this general activation, people have noticed that their concentration is much better. So again, if you're able to focus, if you're able to zero in on the pitches and your noradrenaline is up, then you're going to have that little extra zip to put that ball where you want it. It's those extra hormones, and again, it's just like if you think about it in the wild, you can either be eating 6 times a day and you're that lion that just ate, or you could be the hungry wolf. Like, which one do you want to be? Well, if you're fighting, you want to be the hungry wolf, because your body is actually flooding your system with energy. Now, with elite athletics, there's a lot of nuances, because of course sometimes they're trying to cram like massive amounts of calories in because they're working out all the time. So then you have to design a program that's designed for people specifically. Like, you're trying to get like 10,000 calories into somebody's body. It's not always easy if you're eating once a day kind of thing. So there are sort of nuances, but for the general person who's not at that crazy sort of high athletics, this is a sort of simple hack to make people, give people an edge in terms of their training, in terms of their recovery. So why not take it? Like, it's free. It's there for you to take. Like, there's nothing unnatural. It's not steroids. It's not like, banned substances. It's a natural way to hack your body to be better. And why not? There's actually something called the counter-regulatory hormone surge that happens around 4 a.m. So your body actually knows it's going to be waking up in a few hours. So it actually increases these hormones to push glucose out into your system. So it's actually feeding the body to get you ready for the day. So that's why all these levels are actually a little bit higher. It's not a huge effect, but it is a little bit higher in the morning. Your blood glucose is a little higher, your noradrenaline is a little higher, your sympathetic tone is a little higher. That's the reason that you're not that hungry, because when you're activating, like if you think about the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, if you're looking at a lion, you're not like, whoa, I'm really hungry, I haven't eaten in a few hours, right? You're like, oh my God, but hunger is the last thing you think about. So because your body's actually got a mild sort of fight or flight response, you're actually the least hungry at sort of 8 a.m. in the morning, which is very interesting, because that's also the time of day where for most people, you've gone the longest without eating. So that's really interesting, because you've gone sort of 12 hours, 14 hours without eating, yet you have no hunger. And it's because of the hormonal changes. And that's what I mean. It's all about knowing what hormones are important, how to tweak those hormones. So it's like, okay, if you're body is pushing glucose out into the system. It's burning body fat, pushing glucose out into the system. If I'm not hungry at 8 a.m., why am I shoving, 2 muffins in my mouth? Like, how is that going to help me? And yet people say that. They say, oh, yeah, you have to eat. You have to eat. No, go have a bowl of Fruit Loops. It's like, come on, that's like the worst thing you could possibly do. People will say, well, it's better to eat something than nothing. It's like, no, it's better to eat nothing. Then your body is going to burn the body fat, which is what it was trying to do before you shove that Captain Crunch in your mouth. And this is the whole problem. We have advice that's completely nonsensical, like that. It's like, okay, if you don't eat, what's going to happen? Well, I don't eat breakfast most days. You pretty much get used to it, and that's it. And then when it's lunchtime, you have a nice lunch. And the problem with breakfast is not so much that breakfast is bad. Like, if you eat eggs and bacon and stuff, that's fine. But the problem is that most of us are in a hurry in the morning, so it tends to be highly processed carbohydrates. So Pop-Tarts and Captain Crunch and, stuff that doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't make a lot of mess, easy. It's, you don't necessarily have to even refrigerate it. So we're talking about processed grains and sugar. That's what you want to eat. And that's the worst stuff for you, clearly. So if you're going to eat like a vegetable omelet, with feta cheese and stuff, yeah, that's great. But who's going to make that sort of every morning before they go to work? I mean, not very many people, and that's why they don't. So it's not intrinsically bad. And if you're not hungry, why would you want to eat? Like, your body's already telling you, hey, you don't need to eat. You're doing fine. And then we shove a couple donuts in our mouth thinking that's because the nutritionist says I have to eat breakfast. Yeah, so the longer fast is very interesting because a lot of these benefits are not sort of weight-based benefits. So there's obviously weight loss and reversal of type 2 diabetes. That is, if you don't eat, your blood sugar will come down. But there's also something called autophagy, which is gaining sort of a lot of interest. The 2016 Nobel Prize for Medicine was given to one of the pioneers of its research. What autophagy is it's a breakdown of proteins that the body does when you don't eat. So it probably starts around 16 hours, and 24, 32 hours is where it sort of maximizes. And everybody thinks, wow, breaking down protein, that's really bad. But it's not. Our body actually has too much protein. If you're overweight, it's estimated that you have anywhere between 20 to 50% more protein. And that's not muscle. That's like skin and connective tissue. And you have diseases, for example, like Alzheimer's, where there's also this excess protein that's sort of gumming up your brain. So what the body does is it targets the sort of most useless sort of protein, and it breaks it down for energy. And then when the time comes to eat again, because growth hormone is high, it will rebuild, but it's not going to rebuild protein that it doesn't need. It's going to rebuild protein that is necessary. So what you're doing is this sort of renewal cycle. You're actually taking down old junky protein that you don't need, and then just rebuilding the necessary stuff, but it's brand new protein. So it's actually a sort of, anti-aging and health and wellness sort of thing to keep your body functioning normally. It's really just like changing your oil. Like, if you never change your oil, that is not a good thing. If you're to say, wow, you drained the oil out of your car, that's terrible. It's like, yeah, but we put in new oil afterwards, right? And it's way better than leaving the old stuff in, which is what happens if you don't ever get into this state of autophagy and so on, because what you're doing is leaving all that old junky protein in there, just like leaving the old oil. When you break down the protein and then rebuild, it's like draining the oil out and then putting new oil in, and then you feel, your body is better for it. So there's a whole lot of research into this sort of area, talking about anti-aging and also prevention of Alzheimer's, because that's all that gummed up protein, for example. Anti-cancer benefits, because if you're breaking down proteins, some of it may be these sort of precancerous cells. If you look at skin, so we've had patients lose over 100 pounds. We haven't sent anybody to get their skin removed because, possibly the body has broken down those skin cells, because that's protein that needs to be broken down, the connective tissue, all that sort of stuff. So it's interesting to me, because this is not something that I had actually expected, but it's like, we have these people who lose 100 pounds. We wrote about it on our IDM, on our blog, which is at idmprogram.com. This lady, she writes in, I lost like 100 and something pounds and the skin is all gone. And people notice this all the time. Their skin tags go away and all this sort of stuff. So what it's showing is this very interesting sort of cellular renewal process that might be very important, not simply for weight, but also for general health. And then you go back and say, well, if you look at sort of ancient wellness practices, fasting is everywhere. It's a cleanse. It's a detox. It's Yom Kippur, you're supposed to fast, and Ramadan, you're supposed to fast, and in Buddhism, you're supposed to fast, and Mormonism and Catholicism during Lent, and all this sort of stuff. You realize that people, like religions, when they talk to their sort of parishioners, they're telling them to fast, not because they want to kill them all off. It's because they knew there was something sort of intrinsically healthy about occasionally not eating and letting your body clean itself out of all that junk, which science is just sort of catching up and saying, yeah, when you don't eat, your body cleans out all the junk.
If you do a longer fast, are we talking about zero food, zero anything, or can you?
Classically, it's just water. So water only fast. Okay. Yeah. Certain religions use dry fast.
Fruit or vegetable juice for 36 hours doesn't do it.
No. I mean, there are certain ones like green juice, for example, which probably isn't that bad. But as soon as you start getting a lot of the fruit juices, which have a lot of sugar, then it's going to be kind of, not so good. Because what you're trying to do is actually get your body to burn off all that excess sugar, all that excess fat, and all that excess protein that you've sort of accumulated. It's kind of like, when you're in a house and your basement eventually, that basement room that was a guest room eventually is just filled with junk, right? That's what happens to all of us. The body, and it's the same thing. You want to every so often do this spring cleaning where you just throw out all the stuff before it can accumulate and cause problems. And that's the same thing. This is, and if you're doing the fasting and you're just drinking a lot of sugary water, that's going to work against you. So yeah, classically it's a water only fast, but again, it can, the benefits may happen as soon as, as little as 16 hours, probably in that 24, 30 hours is when you get a lot of it. Well, fasting puts you into ketosis. So ketosis is a state where the body is burning fat. So if you eat very, very low carbohydrates, so your body runs on two systems, either sugar or fat. And whether the body burns dietary fat or body fat is actually exactly the same. So there's no difference. So if you eat a very high fat meal, which is very low carbohydrates, then there's really very little sugar to burn. The body then takes the fat and then turns it into ketones because the brain can't use fat directly. So most of your muscles, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, they'll use fat directly. That fat can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So therefore, you have to either use glucose or you take the fat and turn it into something called ketones, and then your body can use it. So that can provide up to 75% of the energy that the brain requires. And that's why people who say, oh, your brain needs 130 grams of carbohydrates a day, it's like, that's pure garbage, because if you don't eat for 24 hours, what happens? Like, you've done it, I'm sure I've done it lots of times. Like, do I get like seizures because I don't have like carbohydrates for my brain? No. Your body simply produces the sugar or produces the ketones. So the ketones is a way for you to check that your body is sort of in this fat burning mode. So it's like, so remember, body's got to be either sugar or fat. It's sort of like these hybrid cars, right? You either run on electricity or gas. You don't do both. So if you're in this sugar mode, then you have no ketones. If you're in this fat burning mode, then you have ketones. So ketogenic diets are effective because you can measure these ketones and know that you're in this sort of fat burning zone. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll lose weight. If you eat like excessive fat, then you're not going to necessarily lose weight because you're putting in a lot of fat and you're burning a lot of fat, but you're not losing weight because of that, right? So in the end, it's about the balance of that. So it's a way to know that you're in this sort of fat burning zone. But where that fat comes from could be body fat, could be dietary fat. If you're taking a lot of dietary fat, then you're not going to burn the body fat and you may not
Right.
lose weight, which is why
Right.
people say, they sometimes talk about these fat bombs. And it's like, it's fine if you're using those to replace, but if you're adding it, then it's not going to do you any good. That is, if you say
Right.
you have a steak, a certain portion of steak, or you have a steak with a lot of butter, which is going to make you lose weight. Well, adding butter doesn't make you lose weight, right? If you add butter but take out something else, it may. If you take out, add butter and take out the bread, sure, that's probably going to be good. But steak versus steak plus a whole lot of butter, the steak is better because you're not adding all that dietary fat, which the body can burn just the same as it can body fat, but it won't burn the body fat because you've got all that dietary fat.
Interesting. I didn't realize that your body didn't use the ketones, but your brain did. So your body's burning the fat, but your brain is burning the ketone.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you look at, body fat is composed of triglycerides, which is three fatty acids and a glycerol. So the fatty acids can be used directly by most things. And this is what causes the keto flu, for example. So if you were to be an athletic person, like do a lot of workouts, and you went from sort of a normal 50% carbohydrate diet to a ketogenic diet with almost zero carbs, your performance would suffer for about 2 weeks because your body switches from using mostly sugar to fat, and it doesn't have the machinery to burn the body fat efficiently. So if you measure muscle, do muscle biopsies and so on, what you can do is you can find that the DNA and the proteins that are necessary for burning triglycerides increase as you get into this sort of ketogenic state. So they become more efficient at burning fat. But it takes about 2 weeks. So you'll notice a drop off in your athletic performance for about 2 weeks, and people call it the keto flu. Some people feel tired and so on. And then after that, because now your muscles and everything are able to burn the fat, then it just functions pretty normally. But that's what they call the keto flu, can last for a couple of weeks. But the ketones are not used by the muscles, by the liver, by the heart. Everything in the body pretty much uses fat directly. Ketones are really used by the brain. There are specific circumstances where exogenous ketones might be helpful. In general, endogenous ketones is what we're after. That is, burn fat to get the ketones. That's what's going to make you lose weight, because you're burning the fat and getting the ketones, not, oh, hey, here's a whole lot of ketones, but I'm not burning fat to get the ketones. I'm just getting ketones. There are specific circumstances where it may be beneficial. So, for example, in type 2 diabetics, people, as the glucose goes down, the ketones should go up. But that sometimes doesn't happen in certain disease states like type 2 diabetes. Glucose goes down, ketones don't go up, and all of a sudden you have neither glucose nor ketones. And it's like, oh, I feel like crap. So there are certain instances that it may be beneficial, but for most people, you really want to be getting endogenous ketones, not exogenous ketones. Yeah, the fats are another thing. I mean, it's not necessarily the fat, but it's the processing that's really, really dangerous. Because when people talk about ketogenic diets and low carb, high fat, or LCHF, they mostly talk about natural fats. So saturated fats are a lot of natural fats, but what isn't so good is like the vegetable oils, because they are sort of highly processed and very high on omega-6s, which are very inflammatory, and they're not really natural products. So I think one of the things that we've done really wrong is that we've told people to replace natural fats with artificial fats like vegetable oil. So you got to realize that corn is not oily. So you have to process literally tons of corn to get a bottle of corn oil. And that's not a natural situation that your body has learned to deal with, as opposed to eating butter, for example, which the human body has been eating for sort of millennia. The body knows how to handle butter, it knows how to handle cream, and knows how to handle olive oil. All of those sort of natural fats are fine, but the artificial fats, you have to avoid them. There's just all kinds of health issues that come up with them that people are starting to really recognize that, hey, this was not a good idea. I'm always like, So wait, you think that cutting out natural fats and eating a whole lot of artificial fats is good for you? It's like, yeah, when you put it that way, maybe it's not such a good idea. I think coconut oil is fine. I mean, it's there's this person who came out and said, "Oh, it's poison." It's like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, that there are people on islands in the South Pacific that ate 70% coconut. Like, their diet was 70% coconut. So they're eating a lot of coconut oil. And they didn't die. You're calling coconut oil a poison, and here they are eating it breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they're not dying. In fact, they're super, super healthy. And when they migrated those people to New Zealand and put them on a lot of bread and sugar and all that, they all got fat and they got diabetic. But in fact, when they were eating coconut and fish all day, they were super healthy. Yeah, they had infections and stuff, but they had no diabetes, they had no obesity, they had no cavities, all this sort of stuff. They're just way healthier from a metabolic standpoint. So it's like, okay, well, if somebody can eat a diet 70% coconut, well, having a little bit of coconut oil is obviously not going to be that bad for you. So, those sort of ideas are, again, it's a natural fat. People have been eating coconut and coconut oil for millennia without problems. How is it now that you figured out in 2018 that, hey, it was okay for the past 2018 years, but this year your body can't handle coconuts? It's like, okay, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Same thing with meat and butter. It's like, come on. So people have been eating meat and butter and eggs for sort of, okay, minimum 2,000 years, probably like 10,000 years without developing diabetes. But oh, hey, in the last 3 years, we've figured out that meat causes diabetes. Why didn't Jesus Christ get it like 2,000 years ago? Why didn't the Aristotle get it in the ancient Greeks? He was eating meat and stuff. It's like, come on, these ideas are like ridiculous. Like they have no logic. If you overeat meat, could it happen? Sure, possibly. But to say that meat is causing diabetes or coconut oil is causing diabetes or going to kill you or poison, those sort of ideas are completely like out to lunch. I mean, they've got to be the dumbest things. And the problem is that they come from sort of people like academics and so on. And academics are the worst, really, because they don't actually treat people. Like, they don't actually see people who eat coconut oil, for example. So they say, it's bad for you, but they never go out there and talk to people who are eating it all the time and doing great. So they think that, and that they're not interested in helping people. They're interested in being right. Because that's what they do. They're researchers. So they want to be right. They don't care if it doesn't help a single person. So yeah, I think the coconut oil thing is perfectly fine. It's a natural food. Like, you have to, everybody makes things so complicated. Like, if it's a natural food, then it's probably not that bad for you. That's the bottom line.
Oil from coconuts, avocados, olives.
Yeah, so these aren't processed.
Good, but like canola oil or corn oil or processed oil, that's...
Yeah. So remember that coconut oil, you take coconuts, you squish it, and you get coconut oil. Same with olives. Right. Only extra virgin, though. You take the olives, you grind it into a paste, you squish it, and you get oil. If you look at what you do to get, say, canola oil or corn oil, it's much different. What they do is that they take these canola seeds, they grind them into a paste, they spray them with hexane, which is a petroleum-based solvent, which pulls out all the oil. Then they sort of, deodorize, bleach, purify, and then you get the oil. But it's highly processed. I mean, that's not a natural thing. It's not like people ever said, oh, I read these ancient Roman texts about how they were eating canola. It's like, that thing didn't even exist, right? So it's like, okay, well, if it's a newfangled food, maybe it's a problem. If it's a food we've been eating for 10,000 years, so meat, butter, eggs, but also like vegetable. Like, I'm not saying you have to be a carnivore. I'm not saying you have to be a vegetarian. I'm saying eat natural food, right? So if you want to eat whale blubber like the Inuit and very little vegetables, go ahead. You're still probably healthy. If you want to eat almost no meat like most of the other traditional societies, because meat is very expensive, then you can also be very healthy. It's not necessarily an issue with that. It's about the processing of the foods and so on, which is the big issue, right? And this is the whole problem I have with a lot of these sort of movements. The movements like paleo, they start out great, and then they start like, oh, this is the original human diet, caveman diet, eat whatever's natural, and caveman ate. That's a great idea, because now you're eating natural foods. Then people come out with their paleo bars. I'm like, the cavemen were not eating those bars. Like, you're kidding me, right? Like, how can you call yourself a paleo bar? The name itself contradicts you, right?
Yeah,
It's
now everything is
paleo powder.
paleo friendly or keto friendly.
Yeah, it's like the keto
Exactly.
bars. The keto movement was about real food as well. And now you have keto bars. That's not real food. So this is what sort of kills movements, is that you get these sort of people trying to figure out how they're going to make money on that, and then all of a sudden you've got like this stuff that is not real food, and anytime you start processing the hell out of stuff, you could run into problems. I'm not saying you will, but sometimes I look at these bars and stuff, and they're full of like agave nectar or something like that. I'm like, God, that's pure fructose, right? And it's like, that's terrible for you. But then they're calling it a caveman bar or caveman ball or whatever they want to sell, right? And it's like, oh my God, like that's not a good idea. So, the paleo movement, which started out with great intentions and very good ideas, wound up devolving into a huge thing of sort of bars and shakes. Like the caveman were not using we're not drinking their shakes in the morning. Okay, that's not what they did.
Interesting.
When you're eating, eat well, eat natural foods. But when you're not eating, don't eat. Right? Don't say, oh, okay, I'm going to have a muffin and consider that
not eating.
Okay, it's not eating.
Really
when you eat. When you don't eat, don't eat. Right? That's the point. And you've got to balance the eating and the fasting, and that's it. Those are not like radical ideas. They're the ideas that you could have found. Your grandmother could have told you that. Right? It's just sort of common sense that people have always said that. And then don't go. Don't be like, oh, I don't have time for breakfast, so I'm going to buy myself a paleo bar full of processed, I don't know what's in it, right? But it's all this processed chemical stuff. It's like, okay, that's not good. You might as well not eat. That's going to be better for you in the long term.